Each year when we come around to this third Sunday in the season of Advent, we are reminded to tap into the joy that God has in store for us. We're reminded of that, or we would be at least if Monsignor Cordier was liturgically correct, by pink vestments. Did I hear a laugh out there? But certainly by our pink candle. Gaudete Sunday, rejoice. But I might ask us to reflect on, what are we being called to rejoice in? What is the cause for our joy? And let's be realistic and honest. If we're not feeling that joy right now, how do we get there, right? So I want to reflect on these questions with you tonight. First of all, I don't believe that Isaiah the prophet, or Mary, whose Magnificat we heard sung, or Paul in his letter to the Thessalonians, or John, are talking about the kind of happiness that most of us, including myself, spend a lot of our time and energy and money seeking after. The kind of happiness that most of us seek after is a kind of happiness based on having more than being. It's about having the right job, having success, having people think good things about us and say nice things about us. It's about having a certain amount of security. It's about having the right appearance and having things go our way. You get the idea. There's nothing wrong with it. It's based on satisfying our expectations of what it would take really to make us happy. But what we're talking about is a kind of set of conditions and a kind of conditional happiness. Again, there's no real problem with that, but think about it. If X, then Y. If the sun is shining and it's warm out, I can be happy, right? If I have enough money in the bank, I can be happy. If I have the right partner, or people think that I'm attractive, I can be happy. If my team wins, I can be happy. You see what I'm saying? There's that sense of we set all these conditions upon our ability, really, to feel joyful, to feel happiness. All well and good, but a little shaky and problematic, too, because conditions are constantly changing, aren't they? We set those standards, and we don't necessarily get people running to satisfy our expectations. It's like we give our power to be happy over to the rest of the world rather than holding it within ourselves. It's a little bit like if you're out on a boat and the choppy water is like the conditional happiness that many of us seek. It changes from day to day. But if I'm not mistaken, the joy that we're called to today and throughout the season is not that kind of shaky, unstable, changing kind of happiness. It's not conditional. It's deep. It's imperturbable, like the deep water. I believe this is the kind of happiness and joy that our prophet Isaiah knew. I don't know if you know this about Isaiah, but he lived in a time when the Jews were captive in Babylon. This went on for decades. It was as if a foreign power came to the United States, destroyed our armies, and dragged us all off to some kind of foreign country to live in refugee camps. That was the situation of the Jews at that time in Babylon. It's not a very happy time. The conditions don't really seem ripe for Isaiah to tell us or anyone else, rejoice. So what is it that he experiences? Isaiah the prophet has an experience of God's loving fidelity to him and to his people despite everything. And that feeling of loving faithfulness, that experience, fills Isaiah with a sense of hope for a new future, for the possibility of change, and it animates him to risk his own life, really, to proclaim that good news to his people. The conditions are not there, but he finds in himself, in his experience of God's grace, to find that joy. Think of the story of Mary. Again, many of us don't necessarily think of the facts. Mary was probably a girl younger than 16. Maybe she was 13, 14 years old when the Annunciation took place. She must have been, at some level, terrified of the uncertainty of what God was inviting her to do on behalf of God's people, to bear this child, the Christ, into the world. Think of 13 and 14-year-olds you know, and how well they would handle a responsibility like that, right? But then there's another part of it that we don't think about. Mary was found to be with child outside of wedlock. Now that's enough of a scandal in our own day, in our families, in our communities. But imagine in Mary's day, amongst her family and friends, and in a backwater little town of Nazareth. Imagine how she might have been rejected by family members. And yet, that promise of God's loving faithfulness to her fills her with such joy that she runs off and travels for quite a distance to visit Elizabeth, her cousin, in the hill country, to announce, really, this good news. And then there's Paul. Paul was Saul of Damascus once, a murderer of Christians. He had to reform his life. But even after that reform, life didn't get a whole lot easier. Paul traveled tens of hundreds of miles around the Mediterranean preaching the good news. And it wasn't as though he got a welcoming reception everywhere he went. People often rejected him, not just vocally, but physically. At times he was stoned, thrown out of towns, shipwrecked, and imprisoned. But none of that held Paul back from proclaiming his own joy in the presence of Christ in his life. The depth of joy he felt at being given a new lease on life, to convert himself from being a murderer to probably our most famous evangelist. Now, a few times in the past few years, I've gotten very personal with you, and I want to do that tonight, and I hope it's not self-indulgent. But I believe I've also had an experience of the deep joy that Isaiah and Mary and Paul all experienced. But it came to me the hard way, through experience, and a very intense experience of the opposite. About 11 years ago, I was preparing for my ordination. I was in the process of trying to complete 2 graduate degrees and working almost full-time in a parish. I was a bit of a workaholic then, and I continue to be now. But it wasn't only the workaholism. I lost several classmates in the Jesuits who decided that they wanted to leave and become married. And after being friends with these guys for years and seeing them leave, I felt really alone and really unsure about my own vocation. I was afraid to take that next step and commit myself to really an uncertain future as an ordained priest and as a Jesuit. And not only that, but the girl that I had a mad crush on from 8th grade through high school was married that year. And I felt like a chapter in my life came to a close. What happened was it sent me into a depression that lasted for several months, almost a year. It was, without doubt, the hardest emotional time I've ever experienced in my life. I felt all of my independence and self-sufficiency just go down the drain. I felt helpless on a daily basis. And I have to say, if you've never experienced depression, and I hope you don't have to, it's like nothing else. You can't even imagine how debilitating it can be. I thought at times I would never experience happiness again. But at some point, I began to pay attention to my experience and how much I was learning about myself. Learning a lot about the illusions I had about myself and my own strength or self-sufficiency. I started to ask for help from others for the first time in my life. I became open emotionally, not just kind of thinking and talking and relating to people through my head, but really through my heart. It felt vulnerable and scary, but I knew that's where God was leading me. I also felt much more sensitive to the sufferings of other people. And I'd been praying for years up to that point. In fact, I'd been in religious life almost 10 years at that point. But I never knew the reality of God's presence so palpably as I did during that time of depression. I felt like God was near to me, trying to support and hold me up in ways that I had never allowed myself to experience before. And as I began to feel gratitude for that, a kind of joy began to creep into my life. Now, the surface stuff wasn't changing, right? But below the surface, I was coming into contact with this loving faithfulness of God, really for the first time at that level and depth. And the joy that it gave to me has really never left me since then. I've had ups and downs, I've had successes and failures. I lost my dad 7 years ago, whom I really loved. And all of that, nonetheless, hasn't shaken this deep sense of joy in the nearness of God's presence. This Christmas, my friends, we might have all kinds of hopes and expectations for what we receive and what we'll give on Christmas Day. But underneath all of that, I invite you to seek and to find this deep joy, the joy of knowing the nearness and presence of God in your heart today. What will that take? Well, you might have to actually take a look at your life and consider what conditions are you placing on your happiness? Are you postponing joy in your life because of that if-then thinking? If that's the case, I invite you to pay attention to those conditions and let them go. Because God, in God's nearness and love, wants you to experience that joy now. I invite you to pay attention to how you want to be in relationship to others, because it's actually in seeking to make others happy and give them joy that we will discover joy ourselves. This Christmas, I invite you to rejoice, 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 because God's Spirit is as near as your own good heart.